All right, so this week is going to be your first week with your groups. And what you're going to focus on this week is introducing them to the big, broad concept of the series in general, which has to do with this idea that the Sermon on the Mount communicates Jesus' vision of a new world, and that everything about the world is going to be different. It's going to be fundamentally changed from the world that everyone knew before. And our conception of what a good life is, our conception of how we connect with God, our conception of what community is, our conception of morality, all of those things are fundamentally different now because of the reality of the kingdom that Jesus is bringing through his ministry. And so we come to chapter 6, and in chapter 6, what Jesus is going to do is he's going to lay out some ways in which we are now set free. We have to understand that the religion of Jesus' day, the Jewish religion of Jesus' day, was fundamentally about restriction. That the way you observed your religious connection to God was through rituals which articulated a particular restriction from something. You could only walk so many paces on particular days. You had to abstain from certain foods. There was a lot of thou shalt nots in the religion of Jesus' day. But what he does now is he takes those ideas and he turns them to say, no longer are you now a slave to the rituals of your religion. You're now free to experience an intimacy of relationship. That you don't connect with God through your ritual, you connect with God through relationship with him. And so we begin with this idea, the idea that we are free to worship authentically. And so Jesus begins with a section and an idea of prayer. He gives us two negative examples, and those two negative examples articulate for us how we can make prayer a ritual as opposed to a relationship. The first example he gives is the example of the show-off prayer. The hypocrite who stands on the street corner barking out his prayers in a loud voice so that everyone notices how much and with what flowery words he prays. And Jesus brings that as an example of that is not what intimate connection with God is about. That first and foremost, we need to remember that God is the primary audience of our prayers. And so when we pray, when we worship in any way, we need to remember that God is the audience. God's the audience of the prayers that we pray. God's the audience of the songs that we sing. God's the audience of the service that we do. God is even the audience of the sermons we listen to. That our attentiveness to the scriptures, our openness to allow the words of the preacher to communicate God's truth to our hearts, these are all acts of worship that are not directed towards the speaker, they're directed toward God himself. And so all of our worship should, as C.S. Lewis says, run up the sunbeam to the sun. The second example that Jesus gives us is this example of pagans who in Jesus' day, they would babble. That their experience of prayer was just being in these sort of ecstatic states where they would say nonsense and babble and scream. And Jesus says that your prayer life shouldn't be like that either. Remembering that it's not about the quantity, it's about the quality of the relationship. It's not about the quantity of your religious activity. And you see, religion focuses towards amounts, times, frequencies. Have you read your 38 verses? Have you done your devotional? Those types of things. Whereas what Jesus wants us to focus on is, has this interaction connected us with the heart of God? And so you see what Jesus is doing here. He's telling us you're free. You no longer have to be a slave to your religious rituals, which bind you towards other people's expectations and bind you towards connecting with these restrictions. Instead, you're now free. You're free to experience the presence and person of God through real, intimate relationship. And so that's what we're called to. So this week in your groups, what we want you to do is to explore that idea. Talk about the ways that you have in your prayer life, the way that you've allowed what other people might think of you, or other people's expectations, or your own preconceptions to rob you of having true and real intimacy with God. Talk about ways that you can meet God personally and intimately and relationally, in ways that you can become more connected to His heart. Share with each other your struggles and your ideas on how to pursue that, and then spend some time praying with each other, considering how you might encourage one another, and seeking God's drawing you in to a more deep and realistic relationship with Himself. So, have a good week. Enjoy your time together, and we'll see you next week.